Hello and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will begin our discussion on We Cast a Shadow by Maurice Carlos Ruffin. Last episode, we were joined by EPCC student and English major Alejandra Flores discussing the last two sections of Citizen Illegal by Jose Olivares. This episode, as we begin the discussion on We Cast a Shadow, we will focus on the characters, major themes, and connections we've made, as well as having been able to meet Maurice at AWP in San Antonio.
Cool.
We're here.
It's good to, hope everyone's doing well out there. It's finals week for us over here in El Paso, both for community college and UTEP. So we've been kind of busy, and so excuse the delay in getting the first episode recorded and out there. But we're really excited about this book. We had a lot of difficult decisions to make and endless revisions and all that. I wanted to let Richie and Vanessa talk a little bit about why we decided on Maurice's book, talk a little bit about Maurice, and talk about just a little background about AWP as well.
Yeah, awesome. Go for it, Vanessa.
I think part of the reason why we chose this book has to do with that it's not something that we've talked about previously in the other books. And I think meeting him also played a part in that decision because he's such a bubbly personality and he's so nice that I was more intrigued in reading the book.
And could you elaborate on that, Vanessa? I wasn't able to, but you all were able to go to the AWP conference in San Antonio, right? And attend one of his panels?
Yes. So we attended the, I think it was called the How to Do Your Debut Year. And so it was Maurice and Kali, actually, that were on the panel. And so they were just talking to one another because they got published around the same time. And so they've kind of been going through this year of their debut novels and collections at the same time.
Yeah, I thought it was a really nice conversation. So a little bit of context. This most recent AWP was very much thinned out due to concerns from COVID-19, especially at the time. San Antonio had just had a pretty notable case of a patient who was released, and we saw a pretty thinned out AWP. Regardless, though, there was pretty nice attendance from publishers and authors, including the two that Vanessa mentioned. And their panel was really enlightening. I think both Maurice Carlos Ruffin and Kali Fajardo-Lansteen are such great personalities. It's refreshing, they're authors, but you can tell, they have these personalities, and it was really fun to listen to them. The panel initially was supposed to have 4 or 5 people, but in a way, I think this worked out way better because both Maurice and Kali were able to spend a little bit more time sharing their stories, because it's their first release, and I think that's a interesting questions that they were able to answer, and just stories. Really, it was a nice time. It was also probably the most packed panel that I had attended, and I think that says a lot to to them, the authors. I think they attracted a lot of buzz, rightfully so.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. Ever since y'all mentioned it, this book made it, to our ever-growing to read list, and I hadn't heard of him before, so I'm really happy that, and it's serendipitous that y'all were able to meet him and attend this panel. What can you all say about the offer here and the book itself in terms of release date and such?
I think it's interesting that the narrator of the book works in a law firm, but Maurice also was working in a law firm before he decided that he wanted to pursue writing. So I think that was really interesting, kind of seeing that play out.
So it's his debut, and it's got a lot of recognition. What's some of that? And we have the paperback, which just came out this year, but this came out, the hardcover came out last year, 2019.
Well, this book was actually a finalist for the PEN-Faulkner Award.
Yeah.
And it was longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, as well as the Aspen Literary Prize.
And we've had a PEN-Faulkner winner or awardee before with Ben Saenz' book, Kentucky Club book. So it's kind of nice to have another one to add to the list of that prestigious award.
That's right. Go back and check it out if you haven't had a chance to see our discussion with Ben.
Yeah, if you are just tuning in, who just recently, found us, or maybe we found you, you can check out that one. It's a great collection. And before we dig deeper into the novel, we just wanted to do a little housekeeping and mention that, as we mentioned online, we'll be doing other works that we have on the list and that some of you have suggested. We're always open to more suggestions. And we're looking at whether it's novels like this one, short story collections like Ben's, poetry, novel in verse, like Acevedo's, poetry collections, and memoirs as well, as we've done with Black Klansman.
Wow, we've done all that?
I know. This is our 9th book. So
someone suggest a graphic novel.
Oh, that'd be a good one.
That would be so cool.
Yeah. This is, I believe, the publisher, the same for Kali's book, right? Penguin Random House?
Yes.
And specifically One World. And from the beginning, you Richie had mentioned the epigraph for Melville.
Yeah.
So even just, what we're going to do today to listeners is just give you all a teaser of what to expect in this book. But we're looking forward to going over the more specific sections. There's 4 parts to this in subsequent episodes. But just to kind of give readers a taste of what to expect, what did you all make of the 3 epigraphs?
Well, I think, there's obviously an art to the epigraph. I think I've said this in previous episodes. It's not chosen by accident. There's definitely some sort of motif or theme that you're going to see throughout the book. And so I think it's interesting that he chose 3 of them. I think he's trying to be part of a literary conversation. And so, of course, the big one right off the bat is the Ralph Ellison quote. There are a few things in the world as dangerous as sleepwalkers. He also quotes Herman Melville on prejudice. See how elastic our stiff prejudices grow when once love comes to bend them. And lastly, Nabokov, obviously a novelist of Lolita, Pale Fire, several others. Look at this tangle of thorns. I think these 3 together kind of play off each other in terms of the book. But I'm personally more interested in kind of like this theme to Invisible Man. In the past, I know that Jorge, you and I have loved Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. It's a great work of American literature. And so to kind of speak on this idea of literary conversations, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is a book that does just that in its own right. I remember that not only, if you've never read it, I encourage it. You guys should check it out. In that book itself, right, he asks the question, what did I do to be so black and blue, which is from Louis Armstrong's song. Outside of that, though, I think Ellison has noted that he's responding to Langston Hughes. If you've ever read Langston Hughes, wonderful writer, one of his most celebrated poems is Harlem. And I think in that in that poem, he asks certain questions. What happens to a dream deferred? And he asks, he goes on, and in the last part, or does it explode? I think Ralph Ellison is answering that question in Invisible Man. And very much so, I think this book is a continuation of that conversation. Thinking about race in a contemporary sense, there's a lot of conversation to be had, how much has changed, but there's definitely in the beginning pages, I think, a strong parallel to Invisible Man, and I feel like you would agree with me in this. Like I said, we'll go into the future. I guess looking at the future episode, but I do see like this heavily parallel with the opening of Invisible Man, including the fact that we have an unnamed narrator.
Yeah, absolutely, Richie. I'll just echo what you said, and that kind of Burkean parlor that you referenced in terms of in other words, like the endless and continuous conversation about, in this case, race relations that, goes back to, Langston Hughes, like you mentioned, and Ralph Ellison, and continues here in a more futuristic sense. Vanessa, what did you make of the epigraphs?
Well, looking back at them now, I think that they definitely speak to what the book is trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Like especially the different themes that we see within the book. I think that each of them plays into a different part of the book.
Mm-hmm. And then I forgot to mention this, but I was looking at the cover as well, and for the paperback version, it's an apple, the strange fruit, with Nigel, what I presume to be, just kind of like polka dotted throughout the fruit itself is kind of it's gone through that procedure, right? That seems to be the case of the part of the conflict of the novel. So it's a really striking cover.
Yeah, the hardcover actually features the apple as well. I think it's more prominent in the fact that it's similar. You have the apple in the middle, but I think it's also kind of repeated throughout in the background.
So kind of the idea of like a carbon copy.
That'd be interesting to look at that in that sense. I was also going to say about the image of the apple. It's spotted, just like the sun is in the novel. Nigel, he has this spot that's a huge concern for our narrator.
Yeah, and I think maybe then we could transition to some of the connections that we made. We've already mentioned Ralph Ellison, and I think like you said, Richie, goes without saying, one of the great American novels, and still relevant, and very much this is a novel that continues that the way that race is framed in America. But what were some other connections that you all made?
Well, I made a connection with Black Klansman, which we've talked about on the podcast as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in the early moments of the book, but our narrator joins a group and he's trying to convince them that he is one of them. And so I really connected that towards Black Klansman and the way that he's trying to convince them that he's also one of them.
And to readers or listeners who haven't had a chance to read or listen to those 4 episodes of ours, did you want to give them a quick kind of synopsis of that?
Of Black Klansman?
Yeah.
I wouldn't know where to start.
So he's undercover, right?
Right, yes. So it's an undercover detective and he sees an ad in the paper for the KKK, and he thinks it's a prank, so he decides to call, and it turns out to actually be the Klan, and so he decides to infiltrate them, and it's actually a memoir, so it's a true story to some extent. Well, for the most part.
And then it became the Spike Lee adaptation, which we also talked about, which won an Oscar, I believe, for Best Adapted Screenplay, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, that's definitely one of them where you do see that, in the 60s, 70s, when that happened, very much the same issues, right? Whether it's, wearing hoods in the case of the KKK, or in this case, it seems like a, very dystopian. So much worse, than it is now.
And I think also in this book, there's a moment where they mention that there's people standing outside with hoods on. I can't remember exactly where it is, but it's in the first or second section. Yeah, I believe.
And besides Black Klansman, Vanessa, Richie, what other connections did you all want to highlight?
I don't know. Did you have any in mind?
For me, besides Invisible Man, Get Out is it's one of my favorite horror films, and I think Jordan Peele is very much, to me, now becoming a big master of horror filmmaking. Even though he cut his teeth in comedy, but it was very much satirical. You can very much see the satirical element in this one, just like you see in Get Out. And Get Out, if anyone who's listening hasn't seen it, it's basically a story of a Black protagonist who has an interracial relationship wherein he finds out that the girl that he's with, without spoiling it, is not who he thought she was. And so very similar to this one in terms of identity, in terms of feeling like you don't belong because you're Black. Different forms of racism in that one as well, and the satire element as well. The dark comedy, the idea that as you read along, just like in this novel, it makes you feel uncomfortable because you realize, well, did I do something that might have also, not helped sow the wounds of all the hate crimes that have occurred, because I think it's very important that we have an active that we're active, when it comes to that we're not passive, as they say. But, that was my connection, my film connection. And then my other connection was Hawthorne's The Birthmark, because in this case you have Nigel, who's the son of the protagonist, who, and just like Hawthorne's short story, someone becomes obsessed with the birthmark, and the whole irony of it, of course, is it's a birthmark, right? You're born with it. Why change something like that? And the fact that the father wants to have this experiment on him simply so that he won't be Black anymore, right? It's this, of course, an erasure of his identity, and violent erasure, and something that becomes one of the primary conflicts as well in Hawthorne's story, which is set in the Victorian age, when science was kind of still inchoate, still kind of not firmly established, right? In the case of a mad scientist, like in that one. So that was my other connection.
Yes. Well, you were mentioning that it actually made me remember the novel Passing by Nella Larson, which was like I think the 1920s, New York City. So, and in that book, obviously, passing is this idea that if you are of African American descent or race, like if your skin is light enough, you could pass. And that actually does come up in the book a couple different times, but even magnified in the satirical lens, right? This idea that this demelanization process, which brings in that kind of satirical, almost sci-fi element, and seeing all these characters throughout the book who do have plastic surgery to bring their with their lips or noses, just kind of modify how they look in order to pass.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that one, but for sure. Vanessa, I believe he also had another connection to Oscar Wilde.
Yeah, well, it's a small one, but it takes place while the narrator is at a museum.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking about how history doesn't reflect life. It's more that it reflects the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made a connection with Oscar Wilde's preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's that same idea that I have it right here. So in the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray, he writes, "Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril."
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's that idea that it's only as meaningful as you want it to be, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was really interesting. It's not a direct connection, but it's just one that I made.
Yeah.
Because it was what I was reading from my Victorian class. So it was something that kind of clicked.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's interesting, we have a couple examples of Victorian lit, and then others that are more contemporary. And we're just about at 28 minutes, so maybe we could stop here and then continue with the characters.
I actually had one more that I was just thinking about. Going back to Melville, he's in the epigraph. Right. Mentioned that quote from Moby Dick, another great American novel. Yeah. At least according to academia, right? And it's that I think it's the narrator Ismail, when he's observing Queequeg. I guess again, if you haven't read it, go check it out. He says, "See how our elastic, stiff prejudices grow when one's love comes to bend them." I think that's an interesting, reference to Moby Dick. But even the opening passage, right? That's one of the most famous opening lines in literature from Moby Dick, where it says the first line is "Call me Ishmael," whereas in this book you have "My name doesn't matter" as the opening line.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, Richie, because it also reminds me of that Moby Dick as a whale is albino, and so in some sense there's a symbolic connection of the whale in a sense has been demelanized naturally versus this one, which is all an artificial procedure. That we won't say whether it actually happens or not, but of course that's kind of the basic premise of Ruffin's book here. And I think also the same idea of there's this one thing that the protagonist has to chase down, whether it's a white whale or whether it's his son's identity being sucked out of him, right? And all because of some experiment. And so, yeah, that's I think it's interesting both that Moby Dick and Invisible Man are considered, great American novels. And so that Ruffin is kind of opening that door into making us think about how this relates to what we consider to be the great American novel as well.
And or at least, the ideas we discuss in them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right on.
Yeah. Other than connections, Vanessa, and Richie, did you all want to give readers just like a general synopsis of what to expect in this novel?
Go for it, Vanessa.
Well, I think we've kind of mentioned and hinted at this, but it takes place in a dystopian universe in the South, kind of in the future, like the near future. And we're following the narrator, and it's interesting because he does call out the reader specifically, like he speaks to the reader.
Yeah.
But we're following his story, dealing with his son, and we see a lot of the relationship between him and his son.
And that calling out that you mentioned, Vanessa, is very much in line with Invisible Man as well. The attention to the reader that kind of makes you aware of the fact that he's aware of you, that meta language. And you mentioned dystopian. What would you say makes this novel dystopian?
I guess it's perspective, but I think that it doesn't seem like things are getting better, just because of how there is this procedure that is so widely accepted and kind of pushed on people in order to be accepted in society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that kind of goes in hand with the setting. What did you all make of the setting? Just to give kind of, you mentioned, so it's a stubborn city, right? And as far as we can tell, it's not specified, but it doesn't need to be, because, like you said, it's science fiction in the sense that there's this procedure that exists that we don't have right now, and thankfully we don't. But it's speculative fiction in a sense too, that it's assuming that race relations will collapse, and that it seems that African Americans are much more oppressed by then, in the near future, like you said.
Yeah. There's a reference in the book about race riots. And so, when I think, this is conjecture as well, but I'm imagining Ruffin writing this, thinking about Ferguson, and you mentioned it earlier in the podcast, but or I guess from my point of view, it's kind of rough to be reading this and maybe have, like, in the background on my TV headlines about Ahmaud Arbery, being extrajudicially killed on the streets, or even a new name, Breonna Taylor, who was murdered in her home because cops, were following a suspect, and that was already apprehended. So I think there's, going back to Kaepernick and Ferguson and all these, go back to our discussions even then on The Hate U Give. This is stuff that we've been talking about. But I imagine this is what leads to this world in which we're reading. And the scary part, we talk about the dystopian nature of it. In addition to this element of demelanization, that procedure, I think one of the, it maybe even reminds me of Get Out. One of the scary parts in the book for me is, I don't want to get too specific just yet, but when they're visiting a plantation, the truth, the truth that they're presented of U.S. history has been changed. There's a little bit of revisionism, and it's told with such vigor that it's the truth. That's a little bit of a scary part, and that's something I definitely want to dive into for future episodes. The whole plantation scene.
Yeah, and I would just tell listeners and readers, prospective readers, that in that regard, Richie, you mentioned a lot of what's going on right now that seems to be in this, conversation about police brutality enacted upon, minority communities, especially African Americans. like you said, right? I mean, it kind of takes that reality and takes it to a very. I mean, it seems very realistic because of where we are right now, in 2020, and it reminds me also of forgot the connection I was going to mention, but well, the setting. What did you all make of the specific area, the neighborhood?
The one that the family lives in?
Yeah, the one that the family lives in, and then the one that is mentioned as like a highly segregated community.
Well, I mean, I think it's mentioned that the neighborhood they live in is, yeah, you said there's a lot of segregation going on. I think a lot of the way they refer to the neighborhoods throughout the book is like it's on purpose, intentional, built, and in fact that there aren't too many black people living in that neighborhood. To the point where you have these patrol vans, like it's police, but I think they call them something else, surveillance vans, just to like quote unquote check on them.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much like 1984 like language, right? Of like euphemistic, and part of what makes this to many readers might be an uncomfortable read is because of that, because the narrator is very much what reminds me of the sunken place in Get Out, which if you watch it, you know what I'm talking about. But basically the idea being that, he has bought into that revisionist history that you mentioned, Richie, and very much is in this quest with his son for this procedure because of it. And Tico is the other place where it is kind of it is an African American community that is highly militarized and policed, that is constantly referenced, and part of the what makes this a dystopian novel as well.
Right.
Other than the setting, what did y'all want to say about the main characters?
Well, I like that the narrator has these kind of lapses in time. I think whether it's a flashback or he completely skips over a complete span of time. I think that's really interesting in how the story progresses.
Would you say, Vanessa, that for the reader who is prospectively going to pick up this book, does it make it a little hard to follow, or what would you say about the style in relation to that?
I wouldn't say that it's hard to follow. It made me more interested. And I was like, wait, what just happened? How do we not know what just happened?
Yeah.
And I would keep reading. So I wouldn't say that it's harder to follow.
Yeah.
I think it makes it more interesting.
Yeah. And the narrator, much like Invisible Man, goes unnamed, although we won't spoil, but, certainly in the beginning. But what do you make of his profession? So working at a law firm, right? And you had mentioned that Maurice, the author, also worked at one.
Yes. I think it's interesting that he's still able to move up within the firm when he thinks things are going to go the opposite way.
Yeah, I mean, very much willing to do anything pretty much, right, to move up, and without giving away too much, very much apprehensive about whether he's going to get fired or not.
Yeah. I mean, this law firm that we see in the book is very powerful. It seems that, in addition to, I guess, taking on cases, they're involved with a lot of charitable work. I think that it's mentioned. Like they have a lot of. Hold on, I was waiting for that noise to pass by.
Yeah, go for it.
It's really loud.
Yeah, sorry, I was moving.
Oh no, that's fine. So I think you notice in the book that I was gonna say the law firm has some interesting hold, because I think they're trying to even influence who's in office. They're trying to select who's gonna run for mayor, and I think there's some interesting power dynamics happening there. Society in a societal sense, and of course we mentioned just in the racial sense, you have the black workers kind of having to put on a show for them early on, which reminds me of Invisible Man. And I think there's even some commentary on what when people criticize affirmative action. It's hard to talk without spoiling stuff just yet, but you have even though he's well qualified, it's mentioned that he wins cases. He was first in his class. You have some of the people that went to school with him at the same time that that are promoted above him and faster than him, kind of talking down to him still as a diversity hire and all these kind of complaints you hear sometimes.
Right. And you mentioned the Visible Man Battle Royale connection. And the law firm also reminds me of the Brotherhood from the Invisible Man in that same sense that you were talking about, in terms of, they're out trying to influence the politics and the community in a very similar way.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk further on those topics.
Yeah. Vanessa, other than the protagonist, what other main characters would you say readers should keep an eye out for?
Well, definitely his son, Nigel. I think their relationship is something that isn't something that we've seen on the podcast before. I also think that how much the father loves Nigel is why he's willing to take such lengths to be able to provide his son a better life, I think.
Or what he imagines to be, right? And I think it's, we've talked about different forms of love and some other work that I can't remember, but the form of love that he exhibits towards his son is very much because of the way that he is, versus more so this kind of unconditional love, it's, later on we'll talk more about this, but just Nigel, as in terms of his agency, it's kind of interesting and something that we see a lot in, we've seen that in other works, right, with conflicts between parents and their progeny, whether it's, Xiomara and Poet X, and others. So I think that's something that's very notable in terms of him. What about his wife?
I think that one's also important, because you not only get the relationship between the narrator and Penny, you also get the relationship between Penny and Nigel, and the difference in how they treat Nigel, I think.
It's also important to note. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. What was that, Vanessa?
Go ahead. I was just going to say, and how they show their love towards him.
Yes. Yeah, but also I think it's also important to mention that, Penny is white, a white woman. And so you have this interracial couple, which is mentioned in the book as well, as not that common of a thing. And the thing we find surprising, of course, is that it's Penny that's kind of more militant in her defense during kind of racial confrontations that we notice. And I think we can unwrap that in future episodes a little more. But I do think that her relationship to Nigel, as you mentioned, Vanessa, and to our narrator are pretty interesting as well to talk further in depth about.
Yeah. Was there any other major character, Vanessa, that you wanted to let readers know about?
Well, I think there's a lot of characters in this book that play a different role. I think Octavia is another one that I think is really important. So she's the narrator's boss.
How would you describe her? Like, does she seem like she has his best interest in mind, or that she's kind of just using him so far? Just thinking about the beginning of the novel.
It seems to me like she has her own best interest at heart, and she's going to do whatever it takes to be able to be where she wants in life.
And I think part of it is also, our protagonist, unlike what you said, Richie, Penny, who is very much like in the ilk of, an ally who is politically conscious. It seems our protagonist is willing to be very subservient, and apologetic and almost sycophantic to me in terms of how, he's willing to do pretty much anything, right? He's a go-getter. But there's certainly a drawback to this in this kind of world.
Yeah.
And very much like the Invisible Man, too. And so the main conflict in this one that we've referenced already is that experiment that he wants his son to undergo. But did you all have other conflicts or themes that you wanted to highlight?
I can't think of anything at the moment.
Ooh, yeah. I mean, race is kind of like the big one, right? As far as conflicts go or themes.
Yeah, I think because this is a dystopian, futuristic novel, I think it does make to readers, it's going to make you very curious about what kind of world Ruffin is painting. What is it informed of? In other words, like, what is it comprised of? There's a lot of references here to, whether it's literature, like Gone with the Wind, Huck Finn, a lot of references and allusions
to even art.
That. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, so literature and art. I know he makes a couple of references to some artists like Goya and MC Escher.
Yeah. So I think very much in line with other works that we've covered, that are very illusion heavy, and I think it just makes it for a richer experience. So if you readers haven't checked out, whether it's Get Out or Invisible Man, I think it makes this a much more how should we put it?
I would say it would enriches your reading experience.
Yeah. I mean, you could potentially do without it, but I think it just, in terms of making those connections, it just really helps you see what the narrator or the author, is trying to tell you about what kind of future is America headed to, especially right now, not just during this pandemic, but during this administration. Did you all have any closing thoughts before we wrap up shop?
No, I just can't wait to dive into the book.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
So, to listeners out there, like we were saying, we want to do a couple more episodes for parts, the 4 parts. There's 4 parts to this novel.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode discussing We Cast a Shadow by Maurice Carlos Ruffin. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Literally Literary is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.